Welcome to the Cutting the Gordian Knot podcast. I know it's been a bit since I've put out an episode. Hopefully more will eventually come, but I figured I wanted to throw my hat in the mix explaining this whole J.D. Vance versus Pope Francis face-off that we've had recently that even prompted Pope Francis writing a letter to the bishops, something that we will read in full. It's not that long, and I actually think it's pretty good. Now, a lot of people on the right, a lot of Catholics on the right, have come to J.D. Vance's defense. And to an extent, I'll do some of that too, but I think there's actually some fair critiques that haven't been addressed, and I think there's something underlying a lot of what J.D. Vance believes that I really don't like, and I think there's a misunderstanding of the Order of Loves which he professes. So I'm kind of defending Pope Francis on this one. You'll see how it works out. All right, so let's just read the statement that J.D. Vance said, and we'll go through briefly a few of the unfair critiques on both sides, and then some of the fair critiques on both sides before we get into probably the first problem with this statement. All right, he says, as an American leader, but also as an American citizen, your compassion belongs first to your fellow citizens. This doesn't mean you hate people from outside of your own borders, but there's an old school concept, and I think it's a very Christian concept, by the way, that you love your family, and then you love your neighbor, and then you love your community, and then you love your citizens in your own country. And then after that, you can focus and prioritize the rest of the world. So here are the unfair criticisms. One, the people who say, and then, what? I shouldn't love people who are more distant until I've loved these people? Like, do I have to hold off it like a perfect love? No, I don't think that was his point at all. That's an unfair critique. Other people say, well, he thinks that we should just not care about anybody. Like, aren't they human? Aren't they made in the image of God? Come on, that's a straw man. Duh, he's not saying that either. And then there's the people who think that he's just being way too myopic and he made this entire thing up. He didn't make that up. The Order of Loves is a real thing. Aquinas talks about it. St. Augustine talks about it. The New Testament talks about it. So those are the unfair things. There are some who are simply denying that there's such thing as an order of love, and I'm not even really going to get into that. I'm just going to dismiss them with hand waving because their opinions are worth no more. Nobody thinks that their own family should be fed after people they've never met on the other side of the globe, and nobody acts like that. If your kid is hungry, you don't go, well, food's expensive in America. I could spend that same money to probably feed 2 kids in South Sudan. So, sorry, little Timmy, go hungry today. You, of course, wouldn't do that because God gave people who you're responsible for, and you're responsible to discharge your duties as part of a family, as part of a community, as part of a state, as part of a nation. Obviously. So to those people who deny that incredibly obvious and Christian fact, I don't know what you're smoking. So you guys are gone. Let's move to the fair critiques. And the first one is of Vance. You have heard on X and social media and articles that what he's doing, pushing the America First agenda, is kind of going a little bit extreme, where he's really prioritizing not just needs, but also wants. We're the richest country in the world, and he's saying, well, we need to penalize the rest of the world, maybe using tariffs, and to somehow make us richer. And by the way, listen to my tariff episode. I destroy the whole tariff stuff, and I've minted a new pejorative, the tariff fairy, which you guys are free to use. So don't be a tariff fairy like he is. Tariffs don't do what it says on the tin, but they do show that there's this almost giddy impulse among some, but not all, on the right, that they could take from other nations and give to us, right? Just claw stuff back to us, because they were screwing us after all, right? Not what tariffs do. It's a tax on yourself, but whatever. It shows this impulse, which I think is rightly critiqued here, and it could be a subtext in what Vance said. I can't read his mind, so I'm not going to say if it was or wasn't. But I think that's a fair critique, that we do see signs of that type of selfishness in parts of the right, kind of that new right movement, and I don't like it. Another fair point is going the other way, that the Pope, many, not all of the bishops, have been silent about how, I don't know, evil Hamas is, or how evil transgenderism is, or how evil abortion is. They've kind of rubbed shoulders with Democratic politicians who've supported all sorts of incredibly evil things like infanticide, etc., who've pushed for socialist policies which are against the human right to private property and are condemned by the church because it can't be a socialist. I mean, there's a lot of things they've really let slide, and now we're jumping on our Catholic vice president because we didn't like the way he articulated something, and we think his immigration stance is a bit too harsh, even though it's admittedly prudential judgment. I think that's a fair critique. Yeah. Yep. The Pope and the Bishop weren't there for a lot of the issues, and it's kind of warping what people think the church cares about. All right. Now, here's something else I want to point out, and this one's kind of a stickler point of mine. And that is, if you've noticed, he didn't talk about love. I mean, until later on, he was talking about compassion initially. So he started with, your compassion belongs first to your fellow citizens, and then he switches to love, but the two aren't the same. And in the context of compassion, I think we learned something interesting. And this is really the core of this episode. I want to tease out a few differences here, and I'm going to use what we find in the Gospels to do so. Now, if you look at the people that Jesus loves, it's true that he loves Mary and Joseph the most. He loves his disciples. And that love kind of goes out, right? Sure. But his compassion is actually different. And Vance kind of did that swap, and I don't think he really realized that. Because all the places that I could find in the Gospels, and it was not a completely exhaustive search, but the ones that came to mind for me were when he is said to be moved with compassion for the leper, for the demoniac, and for the crowds in the feeding of the 4,000 and the 5,000. And interestingly, each one of the times where Jesus is said to be moved with compassion, it's not for a close family member or somebody who has immediate duty for. Instead, in the case of the leper, it says that he was indignant. He was moved with compassion for this leper and said, I am willing, be clean. And yet they were outside of the community. They're literally a leper. They're kicked out. So this is somebody who's very much other and outside of the camp. And that's one case where he's moved with compassion. The other case would be the feeding of the 5,000. These are people who he could not have possibly all known and had a relationship with. These were strangers. And yet his compassion flares up again in Matthew 15. And then in the feeding of the 4,000, or is that Matthew 15? Anyways, that one is a lot of Gentiles. So it's for Gentiles, people outside of Israel, not in his, country, that he has compassion. And he has a lot of compassion, and he actually feeds them. Now, there's a question from the disciples. They say, where are we going to get that money, right? Because that's like a year's wages. And it turns out that Jesus solves that problem. And it's interesting here that we have compassion for somebody in a foreign group, these Gentiles, and yet there is a question of how on earth do we pay for it? And Jesus basically hand waves and goes, don't worry about it, just do it. Respond to that feeling of compassion for the other. And if that makes conservatives feel a little awkward, hey, I'm a conservative, I understand, but I'm in the camp that we should be extending compassion outward really far and right now. They didn't have a lot of money, they didn't have a lot of food, and yet they still responded to that call of compassion. I think that's a lesson. The next one is the demoniac. Are demoniacs like our people? No. And this guy's over in the 10 cities, and they had a lot of Gentiles over there. And not just Gentiles, but they had Jews which were complicit with the Roman Empire and raising pigs to feed the Roman army. So basically, they're helping to feed the occupation of Israel. These are bad guys, right? This is a bad guy area with somebody who's full of demons. I mean, Jesus has compassion on him, right? This is another incredible example of an other, of somebody who's an enemy, of somebody who he doesn't actually have a duty or responsibility for, and yet he does something miraculous. He kicks out that demon, sends him into the pigs, and they all die. So love and compassion aren't exactly the same. Here's what's going on. Here's what I think. all of the times where Jesus is said to have compassion is in the context of the foreigner, the crowd, or the outcast. And here's why I think that is. It's because his family, his friends, his community, his disciples were united together in love and following him in extending this love outwards. So he was actually leading a redemptive community of sufferers on behalf of others, and he continues to do that. So we ought to do the same. So that's Jesus's model. Why is it that he's having compassion on the other, the outcast, the foreigner? It's because all the people who aren't the other but are among him aren't the foreigner but are as part of the nation that he's establishing, the new Davidic kingdom, and aren't the outcast but are people who are called by Christ, are united in the fact that the little that they have, they will give to feed the crowds. That, yeah, there's risk that if they touch a leper, they can contract leprosy, but they're willing to sacrifice that out of love. And they're willing to make an entire 10 cities angry, the Decapolis, by kicking these demons out and destroying all of their pigs, right? They're actually willing to bear some type of burden for the sake of the other, the outcast, and the foreigner. And they're united together doing that. That's why Jesus isn't showing compassion to the people on the in-group. He's showing it on the out-group, because the people on the in-group are showing compassion with him. They're together and they're united. And that's what I think we need to be doing as community, as churches, as families, and yes, even as a nation. So my criticism of the Vance types and the so-called New Right movement within the Republican Party, certain parts of the whole MAGA establishment, not all, but certain parts, is that they seem to be subtly changing the order of love, which is absolutely true, undeniable, and if you deny it, you're a nutcase, to something which looks similar, but is actually an order of selfishness. It's the order of me, mine, mine. And I don't like that. I'm entirely opposed to that. I think the examples of Jesus Christ and his life go entirely contrary to constructing that type of order. So the order of love says, how do I give of myself in love in the greatest way? And it answers by saying, well, first, I must love God. And he's actually the closest to us because he's closer to us than we are to ourselves. So first, I must love God. And I have to take care of my own soul because I can't give what I do not have. And then, after that, it's the people who are most proximate, tapering off as we get more distant. And that's just garden variety Catholic theology. And if you want much more detail on those two greatest commandments, which I'm implicitly referencing, go back to the Church and State episode where I cover those in depth. So, caring for your own soul and those that God placed in your own care is absolutely essential. And just drive this home, here's probably my favorite verse in support. 1 Timothy 5:8 says, anyone who does not provide for their own relatives, and especially, meaning we have an order of love here, for their own household, has denied the faith and is worse than a non-believer. So if you think you can forego your responsibilities of providing the needs of those directly in your care, then you aren't a Christian. You denied the faith. That is an act of an apostasy by not discharging the duties which God directly gave you for your household and relatives. Incredibly serious. All right. It does, however, get a little bit more complicated on the margins. So do you give your kid a pet pony and decline support for saving a bunch of starving kids who would totally eat that pony in an impoverished nation if given the chance? Well, there it's kind of a question of, well, there's a need in the case of the starving children in South Sudan, but there's a want for you and your family. Now, you do have duties to give your children a wonderful childhood to the extent you're able, but it's a fuzzy line there. There's such thing as excess, right? And if we only concerned ourselves with all of the stuff which is going on in other nations or amongst people who we aren't directly responsible for, well, that actually has some knock-on effects whereby we're basically removing other people's agency in caring for the people that God gave. So we're pretty much steamrolling the people that God has given this responsibility with our own decision to leapfrog over the ones that we're responsible for first and initially. But it does get a little fuzzy when we start to blur wants and needs. But it's not that fuzzy when we're talking about the spheres of influence, which we are aware of and that relate to need. All right. So the order of love is all about how do we extend self-giving love radiating from ourselves because we're in union with God. That's the order of love. The order of self says something a little bit different. It says, I want to get stuff for me and my people first before I get stuff or give stuff to people more distant. Do you see the shift? The one says there's not enough bread to satisfy my own hunger and my disciples' hunger. So I think I'm just going to eat myself and maybe feed my disciples who are my friends, and then I'll send the crowds away hungry. After all, it would take a year's wages to feed all of these people. And listen, after all, a lot of these crowds, a lot of these people in the crowd are Gentiles, and my compassion belongs first to my group. Now, if you think, but that does sound like order of loves, I don't think so. Here's why. Jesus shows that our group, we're actually filled when we're emptied. So if you want to bless yourself, if you want to bless your family, your community, and your nation, like Jesus blessed himself, his disciples, well, he gives that recipe in the Beatitudes. Blessed are the poor. Blessed are the hungry. Woe to the rich. You're filled now. You will be hungry. So the order of loves and the order of self has this, it seems tricky to differentiate. But when Jesus is giving to the crowds, and we see this miracle happen as a result, he's actually loving his disciples and those with him. Why? Because in that giving, they would have been perfectly happy to go hungry if, being moved by compassion, they felt as though they were being called to satisfy somebody else's hunger. Because if you go hungry for another, then God himself blesses you for that act of generosity. So I think that he was actually observing the order of loves by actually giving them something greater than simply food. He was giving them a participation in loving others with God's own love. Now, this actually requires an act of faith united with authentic love. So Jesus sends his hungry disciples into the crowd to feed them, and in so doing, they bring back all the loaves and the fishes. So that's the next part. So this can be scary, right? But we have to respond with faith and in obedience to God. The order of self would say, well, let's not touch the leper, because if we do, I could get sick, and all of my disciples could get sick, and we could have an outbreak, and this is a problem, right? But here's the thing. Jesus is moved by compassion here. It says that he was actually indignant about this. He really wanted to help him. So what does he do? Is he violating the order of loves by touching the leper? Well, I mean, of course, he knows that he will cleanse him, but still, is he violating the order of loves by having his disciples there to witness, to be around this leper? No, I don't think so. Why? Because blessed are those who are hated. Blessed are those who are denounced in my name. Blessed are those who are excluded and insulted. This is a group that was excluded, hated, and insulted. So they're actually willing to take that person's place, if necessary, because of God's love flowing through them. So is he loving his disciples? Yes, he is helping them to enter into his mission of loving others in a way that they will be blessed by God, even through giving up health or wealth or any of these other things. I mean, we could also say the demoniac. He's somebody who was absolutely hated. And when they came in contact with him, It drove out the demon. After killing all the pigs, the people in the town hated them and wanted to kick them all out. So they're willing to be hated. Why? Because the blessing that you get from being hated in doing God's will is way better than the honor that you can get from people. And Jesus is winning these types of spiritual blessings for himself and for his disciples and all that follow him again and again at every opportunity of compassion. And that shows the difference between the order of self and the order of love. The authentic order of love looks at what we can get ourselves and others radiating out, inclusive of these spiritual blessings. That's what Jesus was doing. Let me read you something from Isaiah. It says, "Yet it pleased the Lord to bruise him." This is speaking of the Messiah. "He hath put him to grief. When he shall take his soul as an offering of sin, he shall see his seed, he shall prolong his days, and the pleasure of the Lord shall prosper in his hand." So what's going on here? It says that God was actually pleased to bruise Christ. Or in other renderings, it says that it was actually his will. He said, yes, I will wound the Messiah. So is God violating the order of loves here? Because after all, he sent his only begotten Son for those who were yet sinners. Christ died for them. Is that breaking the order of love? No, it's not. Why? Because the most loving thing that he could do was to send his Son to be the Savior. So how was it that he's loving his Son? By making him the hero of humanity and the victor over sin and death. And this, of course, has to be done willingly, and it was. But this is what God did for Christ. He said, yes, it's my will. It pleased me that he goes through this. Why? Because he's breaking the order of loves one more time? No, it's not. But because God sent Christ on a mission to be the Savior of humanity, even for people who didn't really deserve that compassion while they were yet sinners. So he makes Christ into a hero by sending him to be able to deal with all of the death and crucifixion and evil that he contends with. And that ought to be our example. So when we actually say, yeah, we should all go into situations where we respond in compassion, even if it gives up stuff for our group and our tribe, because if it's with an impelling love, that's a heroic thing to do. That is the difference between a hero and a victim. The same thing can happen to two people. And let's say they're crucified. One of them could be a victim, and one of them could be a hero. And the way to distinguish between those two is, was there an impelling love which brought them to this place? So in the case of the bad thief on the cross, well, he's just he kind of earned it, but it's a little bit much crucifixion for what he did. But he's a victim, right? He's in a terrible situation, and he's just bearing it, and it's without hope and without meaning. But Jesus, right there, right next to him on the cross, is in a very different position. He's not just a victim, he's also a hero, because he chose to bear the cross out of love for us. So, if we're saying, well, people need to go without this or give to others, and we're taking it from people against their will, well, we're making them victims. But instead, if we actually do what Christ did and set an example and lead people in a community of authentic love and ordered love, then we're actually inviting people to be heroes. And that's what I want to see. With many in the J.D. Vance kind of orbit, I don't see that. I don't see us leading one another to be heroes in giving and blessing other people in a way that we'd be blessed given the formula of the Beatitudes. I see more of, I'd love it if he proves me wrong, but I see a lot more of the order of self, me, and mine. All right. One more analogy here. The order of love is like the sun, which has surrounding it and ordered around it all the planets and asteroids. And what is the sun doing at the center? Well, it's giving warmth and light and causing everything to bloom with life, right? And that's the order of love. Now, the order of self is subtly different. It's like a black hole, and things orbit black holes also. And it also creates an order going out from its center. However, it's not giving life and light and warmth. Instead, it's simply the center pulling everything in to consume. That's not good. So, if what you mean by the order of love is you are making a God-empowered act of self-donation to all the people, beginning with those first that you have duty with, and then moving out, duty for, and then moving out, that's fantastic. But if what you mean by the order of love is you're looking to take things for yourself and for the people that you like and you feel like are your people first, even if that means leaving others without, if this is just about you and the people you like getting things, I don't like that at all. That's the order of selfishness, and it should absolutely be condemned. Which leads us to the Pope's letter. It's pretty short. Dear brothers in the episcopate, so it's to the bishops, I am writing today to address a few words to you in these delicate moments that you are living as pastors of the people of God, who walk together in the United States of America. The journey from slavery to freedom that the people of Israel traveled, as narrated in the book of Exodus, invites us to look at the reality of our time, so clearly marked by the phenomenon of migration, as a decisive moment in history to reaffirm not only our faith in a God who is always close, incarnate, who is always close, incarnate, migrant and refugee, but also the infinite and transcendent and, oh my goodness, transcendent dignity of every person. So what's he saying here? He wants us to think about this whole thing in the context of the book of Exodus, which I think is kind of an interesting start because it is the beginning of the salvation story. And we see that immediately they're pulled out of their nation and they're sent to another. They're sent to migrate, and a lot of people aren't happy about this. Now, it's a very special case, and I wouldn't say that this is the blueprint for all migration, because the land was given to Abraham, and they were going to inhabit it, and we can't always pull everything from this story. But here's what we can pull from Exodus. Throughout the Old Testament, forever after, all of the laws about governing foreigners and visitors are linked to the Exodus. They say, you were once wanderers, you were once foreigners, and we're called to treat others as we would have them treat us. So he says that Jesus is identifying here with an incarnate migrant. Maybe a little bit of a stretch, but Jesus did have the migration into Egypt and out. Yes, it was all part of the Roman Empire, but he recapitulates the Old Testament story in his life, right? He has to flee persecution. He has to move. He has to avoid these threats. That's something that he actually lived, and all of his life is saving. These words with which I begin are not an artificial construct. Even a cursory examination of the church's social doctrine emphatically shows that Jesus Christ is the true Emmanuel, God with us. He did not live apart from the difficult experience of being expelled from his own land because of an imminent risk of his life, and from the experience of having to take refuge in a society and a culture foreign to his own. The Son of God, in becoming man, who chose to live the drama of immigration. I like to recall, among other things, the words with which Pope Pius XII began his apostolic constitution on the care of migrants, which is considered the Magna Carta of the Church's thinking on migration. Quote, the family of Nazareth in exile, Jesus, Mary, Joseph, emigrants in Egypt, and refugees there to escape the wrath of an ungodly king are the model, the example, and the consolation of emigrants and pilgrims of every age and country, of all refugees of every condition, who, beset by persecution or necessity, are forced to leave their homeland. beloved family, and dear friends for foreign lands. Now let's pause right here. Notice who he's addressing. He's not addressing everybody. He's providing for us a very, good example, right? Jesus was not leaving because he's like, well, carpentry doesn't pay much here in Nazareth here, so we're going to build stuff in Israel or in Egypt. Maybe stack some of those blocks, make a pyramid. We'll be stacking cash. No, that's not why he left. He was leaving because of an evil king who is intent on killing him, and that's a really good reason. So this is what he calls to mind. First, the Exodus, right? So they were in slavery. They were in this terrible condition. Their government itself was oppressing, persecuting them, and stopping them from being able to worship God. And in the next case, where Jesus recapitulates the Exodus story in his own life, we have something very similar. An evil king is killing them, just like they were killing the babies in the Exodus story. And this is a very good reason to leave, and other countries ought to be able to accommodate you to the extent that they're able, because you're fleeing for your life. So that's how he starts. And that doesn't mean that you're just fleeing for your job ambitions, which is very different. Likewise, Jesus Christ, loving everyone with a universal love, educates us in the permanent recognition of the dignity of every human being, without exception. In fact, when we speak of infinite and transcendent dignity, we wish to emphasize that the most decisive value possessed by the human person surpasses and sustains every other juridical consideration that can be made to regulate life and society. Thus, all the Christian faithful and the people of goodwill are called upon to consider the legitimacy of norms and public policies in the light of the dignity of the person and his or her fundamental rights, not vice versa. And this, I think, is fair, right? Here he's saying the dignity and the identity of the human person is upstream of the laws, norms, and policies which we establish to regulate the life of such people. So when they come in conflict, we ought to look first to the dignity of humans and not just to our norms, laws, customs, or anything else. Yes, fact check, true. I think that's fine. And although I wouldn't say that the majority of, say, the right, who are pushing more strict immigration policy, are running afoul of this, I do think there are some who legitimately have a type of real disdain for immigrants, which I don't think is befitting their human dignity. So I do think that is a caution for some, but a minority. I have followed closely the major crisis that is taking place in the United States with the initiation of a program of mass deportations. The rightly formed conscience cannot fail to make a critical judgment and express its disagreement with any measure that tacitly or implicitly identifies the illegal status of some migrants with criminality. At the same time, one must recognize the right of a nation to defend itself and keep communities safe from those that have committed violent or serious crimes while in the country or prior to arrival. That said, the act of deporting people who, in many cases, have left their own land for reasons of extreme poverty, insecurity, exploitation, persecution, or serious deterioration of the environment damages the dignity of many men and women and of entire families and places them in a state of particular vulnerability and defensiveness. Again, I'm sorry, that's a balanced statement, guys. So just like if you were starving and you found a mountain cabin and you just jimmy the door open and then you eat what's found in the pantry, well, that is really not criminal, because what we've done is we've put upstream the value of this life, and downstream we figure out all the legal stuff later. Because you were starving and it was not the position you put yourself into, let's say, yeah, you would have a right to grab that food out of the pantry, and then whenever you can, you would then make recompense and you'd say, hey, sorry, I ate all your food. And the reasonable response would be, oh my gosh, of course, you were starving. I'm glad you found my cabin. So that's what we need to do in this case. If people have extreme poverty, which he points out, or if they are in insecurity, they're being persecuted, right? Like if it's something analogous to the way he started this whole thing. The story of the Exodus. They're being persecuted. They're insecure. They're not given the things that they need. If you're in this situation, then the proper response could be you cross the border, and we shouldn't treat this as criminality. We should suspend some of our ordinary ideas of what is, what is the right policy or custom or law, and look instead to the dignity of these people who we want to not be exploited, not starve, and not be persecuted. That's right, okay? And what we should do is not go, oh my goodness, these filthy immigrants coming in. We should say, I'm so glad you made it. Oh my gosh, you were literally starving and you came here. We want to be a great host nation. I hope you guys become incredible citizens at some point. That would be the right response. And he also says that what we're describing here does not bar us from stopping criminals from entering, nor does it stop us from deporting criminals. So he's actually circled a very specific group, people who are in a terrible situation, who are not criminals, who are coming here in order to deal with a need, not just a want, but a need. And this is the group he thinks that we should be bringing in, inviting in as good hosts. He doesn't say we have no border. He doesn't say we don't have a right to defend ourselves. And he doesn't say that we don't have a right to keep our communities safe. All of those things are in place, making this, I think, a lot more balanced than a lot of people have been saying. I try to call balls and strikes fairly. I've had criticisms of Pope Francis. I normally try to keep them to myself, but this is a case where I think he's doing fine. He goes on, this is not a minor issue. An authentic rule of law is verified precisely in the dignified treatment that all people deserve, especially the poorest and most marginalized. The true common good is promoted when society and government, with creative and strict respect for the rights of all, as I have affirmed on numerous occasions, welcomes, protects, promotes, and integrates the most fragile, unprotected, and vulnerable. This does not impede the development of a policy that regulates orderly and legal migration. However, this development cannot come about through the privilege of some and the sacrifice of others. What is built on the basis of force and not on the truth about the equal dignity of every human being begins badly and will end badly. So that's the next part that we were kind of talking about earlier, that when Jesus is leading this group of people to self-sacrifice and help the people who are other, who need compassion, this is voluntary. Just like Jesus came to be incarnate voluntarily. Well, he invites us into his work to do this voluntarily, because Pope Francis points out here that all of us have an equal human dignity, and that what we're not trying to do is just use force to benefit some and others. What we're meant to do here, what he's calling for, is a voluntary cooperation, a voluntary movement of compassion from what comes from a properly formed conscience in light of the real needs, not just wants, of people who are truly vulnerable. Yeah, and he also tells us that this should be regulated in an orderly way, and there ought to be legal migration. So I don't think this at all contradicts having a sealed border and then making an orderly, fair, and safe way to enter. Because right now, it's none of those things. It funds the cartels. It funds human trafficking. It's incredibly dangerous, especially for women and children. And it's an absolute tragedy that this is happening at our border. So we need to secure it and then respect human dignity, starting from their side of the border into ours, making sure that people are not being exploited, not being assaulted. Why? Because what comes first is putting our eye on human dignity, and that's something that we can preserve here. As far as a creative solution, that's going to have to be the next podcast. I can lay one out for sure, which would be voluntary, would be creative, would fix everything, and you have to wait for that episode. Christians know very well that it is only by affirming the infinite dignity of all that our own identity as persons and as communities reaches its maturity. Okay. We're going to go through this one slowly because it seems to be targeting J.D. Vance in the next few lines. And we're going to see if it's fair or unfair or if he's making another point. Christian love is not a concentric expansion of interests that little by little extend to other persons and groups. In other words, the human person is not a mere individual, relatively expansive with some philanthropic feelings! ! Okay, what's he saying here? Well, first, he's saying that it's through affirming the dignity of others that our persons and our communities reach maturity. What was my point earlier? My point was that Jesus, as an individual, is bringing a community to actually mature past simply the wants of food and security and health and being liked, to be able to enjoy the spiritual goods of, well, beatitude of itself. So he is making that as the offer. So I think this is kind of his point too. And he goes on to say, Christian love is not a concentric expansion of interests that little by little extend to other persons and groups. So he doesn't say it's not a concentric expansion of duties. It is, right? He would agree with that. Oh. Nor does he say it's not a concentric expansion of loves, because there is an order of love. He says it's not a concentric expansion of interests. What's he condemning, folks? Covered it earlier in the episode. He's condemning the order of self. So if you want to set up a concentric circle of things which help your own self-interest, this is condemned. It's condemned right here, and for good reason. So you're not just meant to say, I want me, mine, and for the people that I like most and are most immediately around me. No, authentic love includes opportunities for self-donation to the other, powered by the love of God, because that gets you something so much higher than what fills bodily hunger, etc. Keep going. In other words, the human person is not a mere individual, relatively expansive with some philanthropic feelings. So he's also condemning here that philanthropic feelings, like the feeling of compassion itself, isn't what we're targeting. What we're targeting is a response to human dignity. I think that's what he's saying. The human person is a subject with dignity who, through the constitutive relationships with all, especially the poorest, can gradually mature in his identity and vocation. The true Ordo Amoris, order of loves, that must be promoted is that which we discover by meditating constantly on the parable of the Good Samaritan. That is, by meditating on the love that builds a fraternity open to all without exception. Right. He tells us, meditate on the Good Samaritan. So let's do exactly that. So we got your back, Pope Francis, on this one. What happens in the story? Well, there were priests and Levites that had to go and offer sacrifice. So the subtext of this parable is that the sacrifice that God actually wants is not what they're going to do. What he would actually prefer is the sacrifice of mercy, right? So they thought that their work would cleanse the people of their sins and make them right with God, right? That's the purpose of the Old Testament priesthood. And they thought that the order of loves meant that they would keep themselves clean and undefiled, and then they would go and, well, head off to serve their family, their church, their nation. That's what they thought. And is that so unreasonable? You're a priest, you're a Levite. You have to go and benefit your nation, your church, your family. You have to help connect people with God. And you also need to make sure that you're not contaminated with a dead body, because if you are, well, you can't do any of those things because you're unclean. So it kind of feels like you even have duties to do, right? Wrong. So Not that the order of loves is wrong, but that's not how it works. So you, your church, your nation, all of these will have its sins cleared and will be blessed from heaven when you do as Christ did, when you live a life of radical self-donation and respond in compassion to others and lead others in doing the same. That's the point of this story that I see. Why? Because one group thought, well, I need to care for the things which are here. I need to, not defile myself. And the other person said, all right, I'm just going to respond to the compassion. I'm going to give of what I do have. And then I'm also going to call this innkeeper into the service of taking care of this person who needs to be cared for. So I think that illuminates, once again, the fact that there's an order of love that does actually respond to compassion and is self-emptying and self-giving, and is an act of faith, I would add, from the order of self, which simply looks for what interests of mine, say being clean on the Sabbath, or being able to do my job, or not having to pay a year's wages to feed this crowd. So it doesn't look to just looking to your own concentric circle of interests is condemned by the Pope here. And I think he's right. It's a bit nuanced. I hope I'm explaining this right. I guess I'm out of practice podcasting. But I think you guys probably got it. And we just have one or two more paragraphs here too. But worrying about personal, community, or national identity apart from these considerations easily introduces an ideological criterion that distorts social life and imposes the will of the strongest on the criterion of truth. Yeah, I think that's fair that, right, you shouldn't have your identity, be it national or anything else, get in the way of responding in compassion, empowered by God's self-emptying type of love, right? Sure. Let's see. Well, let's hit the next part that he has here. I recognize your valuable efforts, dear brother bishops of the United States, as you work closely with the migrants, refugees, proclaiming Jesus Christ and promoting fundamental human rights. God will richly reward you for all you do in the protection of the defenseless, or of those who are considered less valuable, or less important, or less human. Now, I think that's a bit of a straw man. I don't think anybody's saying that they're less human. I really hope not, anyway. Goes on to say, I exhort all the faithful of the Catholic Church, that's many of you listeners, and all men and women of goodwill, that should be the rest of you, not to give in to narratives that discriminate against and cause unnecessary suffering to our migrant and refugee brothers and sisters. With charity and clarity, we are all called to live in solidarity and fraternity, to build bridges that bring us ever closer together, to avoid walls of ignominy, and to learn to give ourselves as Jesus Christ gave his for the salvation of all. So that's the point. Learn to give of yourselves and your lives as Jesus Christ did. All right. Let us ask Our Lady of Guadalupe to protect individuals and families who live in fear of or pain due to migration or deportation. May the Virgin Marana, who knew how to reconcile peoples when they were at enmity, grant us all to meet again as brothers and sisters within her embrace, and thus take a step forward in the construction of a society that is more fraternal, inclusive, and respectful of the dignity of all. Fraternally, Francis. All right. I think that's good. I'm standing up for Pope Francis on this one. I think that was, yeah, he nailed it. He made the important provisions for criminals and for needs and whatnot. I think that's really good. And we ought to, at the end of the day, keep our eye on human dignity and treat people as we would wish to be treated. I mean, we can recall the biblical injunction that you were once foreigners. Now, maybe you weren't specifically a foreigner, but hey, if you're listening in America, you're in a nation largely of immigrants, many settlers too. But also, when you're connected into Christ, you're connected into his story, where he did have to flee a nation. And that's part of your identity as a Christian. And we should respond as such. Okay. Let's talk about immigrants a little bit. We're going to hit a few questions and objections. You're going to learn a wee bit of data, and I'm going to look over the notes that I wrote another day or two ago and try to make them make any sense for you guys. All right. Here we go. Here's one thing I want to point out. To clarify why the type of order of loves, which is often talked about, though not always on the right, can't make sense all the time, because they're thinking of it as a concentric circle of interests and not a mode by which you can dispense the very love of God to the people who you have duty for. We can offer a bit of an argument. So they might say, one ought to prefer the goods of one's own family over the good of more distant relations. The nation is more distant than the family. America is a nation. Mexicans have families. Wait, therefore Mexicans ought to prefer the good of their own families over that of Americans, over the American nation. My goodness. So if we take that, if we're just looking at interests, when we're treating the order of love as an order of concentric interests, then we get a contradiction, whereby many in the United States might say, well, we should seal the border because that would help our family, because maybe we're worried about a supply shock of labor that would drive down our wages, though there's things to cover there. And then the Mexicans would have the exact opposite thing to do, all with the order of love directing them? That's very strange. I don't think that authentic love creates this type of division or chaos or contradiction. Far from it. Paul says, love is patient, it's kind, it doesn't envy, it doesn't boast, it's not proud, it doesn't dishonor others, not self-seeking, it's not easily angered, keeps no record of wrongs, doesn't delight in evil, rejoices in truth, protects, trusts, hopes, perseveres. So in the actual order of loves, we shouldn't expect any type of these bad fruits, this division or this contradiction, which would drive some to the border and some to drive them out of the border. Instead, in the real order of loves, there isn't actually a contradiction, because love is a call to self-gift. So the order of love could just be an order of self-gifting. So the call on the Mexicans is to give their family a better life, to be good citizens in their host nation, or maybe the one that they find themselves in now. And then the order of love would mean that we would offer to those who are in need what we can offer from our nation, in our families and communities. And then they would respond by accepting that gift and returning it with respect for our culture, traditions, way of life, etc. That's not a contradiction at all, because we're not just looking at interests. We're looking at the dignity of others, and we're responding with love. So here's some things we have to say to immigrants. A lot of this is talking about the host nation, and we actually have things to say to both, right? One is, immigrants are not actually entitled to live in one's nation. So it's somebody else's nation. Be grateful, honor, and respect the culture and heritage of that land, as the Catholic Church teaches that you must, by the way, and I think we'll get to that catechism quote. Also, I think that immigrants should take a very hard look at what made their nation unlivable, and don't repeat that here. Also, you got to observe the hierarchy of loves correctly in your own lives, meaning abandoning your own people and nation is no small thing, and you cannot do that without a good reason. Let me give you a story. This was maybe 8 years ago or so, there was a whole Syrian civil war, and our church decided, well, maybe we'll help some of the immigrants that would come in. This is a Presbyterian church. And we had one guy who is a Syrian, quote-unquote, refugee, and he left his country, and he was a civil engineer. And they were beginning some of the rebuilding phase. He was actually part of the Assad regime. I asked him, I'm like, so were you in danger there? He's like, oh, no, not really. Oh, okay. Was there like a food problem? Well, yeah, for some, maybe so, but we were okay. As a civil engineer, kind of up there to say, like, why are you here, dude? It's like, well, things are falling apart, and I figured take advantage of the fact that I could come to America now and I already spoke English from some international travel and whatnot. So I figured I'd just work here instead. It's certainly a lot more comfortable. Is that a good immigrant? No, that's a bad guy, right? Because they needed civil engineers to serve that community, to serve those families, to serve those nations. After a bunch of the infrastructure, many cities were blown up, and he left. So he's not observing the hierarchy of loves. He's not somebody who can knock on the door to the United States and say, hey, I am one of the people that Pope Francis just described in extreme poverty, where I'm being persecuted. No, he's simply there as somebody with a want, not a need. So just like if somebody knocks on your house door and says, hey, your house looks way better than mine. Can I just live in your house? You go, well, no. But on the other hand, if you see somebody who has a car accident right in front of your house and they're bloodily dragging themselves towards your house for help, you would of course invite them in, right? It's not that they have some right to your house or that they own your house, but you respect their human dignity and you bring them in your house and you give them the care that they require because they're in urgent need. And that's what love is. We respond to that call of compassion. So if you're an immigrant who's clawing their way in some desperate state, let them in. But if you're the other group, and if you're one of those immigrants, then I think you're taking advantage of the generosity of others. And you need to give a hard look whether or not you're actually respecting the order of loves with respect to your own nation and community. So that's the question. Are you leaving because of necessity? Or is this just a luxury that if you got in, it'd be nice for you, and maybe you should come for that reason, but it doesn't mean that you are assured a place as a result of our call to be generous. I'll remind you that back in the Old Testament in Israel, anybody can join Israel. Like, it's fine. You're in a Gentile nation. You're a Gentile. You want to become a Jew. Okay, get circumcised. Observe the law of Moses. Like, you could get in, bro. Like Rahab the harlot. She was a harlot. She was a Gentile. She was able to enter the covenant. She's even in the bloodline of Christ, right? So Israel allowed people in. Perfectly fine. However, you had to abide by those laws. You had to respect those customs. Typically, like other nations, you weren't able to, I got to fact check this one, but I'm pretty sure you weren't able to actually hold any higher offices of governance. And in other nations, it was for 3 generations, which I think is totally reasonable. And that's part of respecting the way that culture was already set up and living there as a guest until you were fully part of that community and fully acclimated. If you broke the covenant, you were exiled from Israel. That went for everyone. So deportation is not something that's alien to the Bible. It's actually one of God's laws. You can get deported in the Old Testament if you do something really bad. And Pope Francis agrees. If you do a certain crime, get them out. You can deport those people. That's fine. All right. So immigrants, you're going to be grateful. Observe the customs of your native nation. If you commit crimes, totally fine to deport you guys. All right. Common questions and objections. Oh, let's see. It's all well and good that you want to help all these immigrants, but many people in the U.S. need help right now. Like, they have needs, so you're all about needs and love. So where's your love for these guys? There's people in need. First off, we are the richest nation pretty much in the history of the world. And there's a difference between the poor who are poor through their own fault and they're bearing natural consequences, which are justly borne and often medicinal for their souls, and those who are poor through no fault of their own. So Paul says of the people who will not work, who are choosing against this, who are poor and hungry through their own fault, says those who will not work shall not eat. Like, don't feed them. You don't do it. You just be, what do you call that? Enabling these people. So be an enabler. Paul says, you will not work, shall not eat. For those people who are in the second category, it first falls, order of love, folks, to their direct relatives, friends, their community, their church, way before a federal program or some type of giant federal intervention to help them. So they ought to be helped locally first. And for those who don't help the relatives who are in urgent need, who are starving to death, and you're not providing for them, well, you're you're worse than somebody who's a complete non-believer. You've abandoned your faith if you've done that. So we got to take this order of love seriously here and say it's not the nation as a whole's responsibility. It's the people who are most proximate. And I'll add, as a nation, we absolutely already have a massive amount of programs for the poor. We won't get into all that, but I will leave you one statistic that the amount of transfer payments to the lowest 20% of earners is more than the value of all the wages that the middle 25% or 20% earn in income in the U.S. That is ridiculous. So we're literally transferring more to the bottom 20% than the middle 20% earn in income. We can talk about how that's administered. That's another podcast. We have more than enough to care individually, and we already do probably too much corporately. All right. I'm going to add one more thing. By bringing in immigrants, a lot of people think that we're like giving away the farm here. We're not. If you work, you are creating, unless your boss is terrible at math, you're creating more value than you consume, which means you're adding to the economy. You're adding to the wealth of the nation. And it's true that if a bunch of immigrants come in and they work for very low wages, it could create a supply shock in a particular industry, driving down those wages. But it's only driven down because you've driven down the cost of products, which means there's a group that you might see getting harmed, but there's a enormous group of people who you don't see who are benefiting. So when we bring people in and they say, yeah, whatever, I'll pick the tomato for $15 an hour. Done. I know nobody else wants to do it. I'll do it. Well, then they're driving down your food bill for every single family in America. So they're not as burdensome as you think is the first thing I'm going to say here, that they create enormous economic value and they commonly consume not that much, which brings us to the next objection. Listen, it's impossible to have lots of immigration to accept these needy people in, like you were saying, you and your Pope, if we have a welfare state. And I have so many criticisms of the welfare state that I would talk myself hoarse for days if I began. But instead, I'm going to point something else out. So according to Alex Naursta and Michael Howard in their briefing paper from 2023, Immigrant and Native Consumption of Means-Tested Welfare and Entitlement Benefits, immigrants consumed 36.9% less Social Security than natives, 26% less in Medicare, 10.9% less in Medicaid, 11.5% less in SNAP benefits, and a shocking 87.6% less than natives in TANF benefits on a per capita basis. So, immigrant to native person, it's simply not true that they're milking the immigrations or the welfare state more than natives are. They're doing it profoundly less, like by a lot. Here's something else you often hear. Well, they're all criminals. I think you'll find this interesting here. So this is a quote from migrationpolicy.org, and it's referencing a study here. It says immigrants are prosecuted and imprisoned at lower rates than the U.S.-born immigrants. Immigrants in the United States have a lower incarceration rate than native-born population since at least 1870, when data was first recorded. In 2020, immigrants were 60% less likely to be incarcerated than the native U.S.-born, according to a study by the National Bureau of Economic Research. Though a 2021 Justice Department study points out prosecutions of immigrants increased between 1990 and 2018, nearly 90% were for violations of immigration-related laws. Notably, U.S.-born citizens were 10 times more likely than immigrants to be incarcerated for committing weapons-related offenses, 5 times more likely for violent offenses, more than twice as likely for property crimes, and nearly twice as likely for drug offenses. And some data from Texas, not exactly a squishy liberal place, well, Austin. Anyways, Texas Department of Public Safety shows that the legal immigrants were arrested about 40% fewer times than natives. And here's the really interesting part. Illegal immigrants were almost 3 times less criminal than U.S. natives. So, turns out, illegal immigrants are the least criminal, followed by legal immigrants, followed by native-born Americans. And it's not close. If you find an illegal immigrant, 3 times less likely to be criminal. And I really like that national level data that talked about violent crimes, weapons-related offenses. What was that? 10 times less likely? 5 times less likely to have a violent offense. Now, I'm sure in the news you've heard a lot of cases of illegal immigrant comes in and does X, Y, and Z. Well, listen, get rid of them. Don't let criminals come in. Everybody's on board. Pope Francis is on board with that one. But the fact that writ large, these people who are coming into our nation are incredibly criminal is false. Weed out the bad ones, and these numbers will get even better, which is great. All right. Here's the next one. Well, what would you say about all these Islamic immigrants, say, in Europe, who are trying to make Sharia law, who are grooming, who are sexually assaulting women and children? Well, I'll tell you exactly what I say about that. Scripture makes clear that rape is as the sin of murder and thus carries death penalty. So I would say that publicly execute, Pope Francis wouldn't agree with me on the death penalty, but maybe the next Pope will. All the former ones did. Publicly execute them in those communities as a sign that this can absolutely not be tolerated. And anybody tries to stop you from publicly executing them, use whatever force is necessary to put down that. Yeah, there you go. And then remove anybody with any type of criminal record like that and deport them immediately, or give them punishments in their own country and then deport them. Whatever you think is best. Also, anybody who has come in to try to push their Sharia law is not doing what the Catechism said is the immigrant's part of the bargain, to respect the law, custom, and heritage, including religious heritage of the country. In other words, they've broken the covenant. And in the same way that in the Old Testament, if you break the covenant, you get exiled. I say that if you are supporting Sharia law, if you're seeking to flip your country into being an Islamic country, or if you're doing any type of things like that, you should immediately be deported without any questions. So that's what I would say. I'd say death penalty is great for this. It would send quite the message. And at very least, incredible punishments and deportations, and stop any groups who have proven that when they enter the nation, it is not simply need, it's just the desire to take over your nation. That's not okay. In Sweden, I believe they found that of these refugees, people who supposedly arrived and couldn't go back to their nation because of some type of horrible whatever they're experiencing, 73% of them went back on vacation. So if they're vacationing back from where they came, I don't think they're legitimate migrants at all, right? Again, the story that Pope Francis began with was the Exodus, and then he pivoted to Christ's life, and then he specifically talks about the most vulnerable, those who have specific and pressing needs. If you don't have those things, then there's absolutely no reason why you should claim a right to enter into another nation. So there you go. All right. I think that does it, guys. So to sum up, if you spaced that whole episode, there's a difference between the order of concentric circles of self-interest, the order of self and me and getting for the people that I like, and the order of love, which at its height, when Pope Francis says we actually are reaching spiritual maturity, we're actually targeting the goods which are spelled out in the Beatitudes, which involve acts of self-donation for people that God asks us to respond in compassion for. That's what Jesus' life did. That's what we should do. So, J.D. Vance, stop being a tariff fairy. Good job on most of your immigration policy. Don't get rid of the good guys. Get rid of the bad guys. That should be a very common sense notion. I know many people, some of which are illegal immigrants, because I work in construction. I meet all sorts of people. They ask me, what's your opinion? And I say, well, the bad immigrants should be deported, and the ones who are good and wonderful for our nation working hard, raising families, abiding by our laws should absolutely stay. They're like, yeah, we think so too. So the good guys are all on the same page, even amongst the immigrants. They don't want criminals. Nobody wants criminals. Nobody wants the nonsense at the border that we have now. It's the whole paperwork to actually get in is insane. The wait lists are unbelievable. The costs typically are horrendous, and the journey is incredibly treacherous and assaults human dignity at every turn. All of those things are things that we need to solve. And in the later episode, I will explain exactly how I will solve it, because part of the statement that Pope Francis said was that people of goodwill, rightly formed consciences, all of these people need to actually think about creative policy solutions for this. So I think that's our cue. All right. Well, I hope you join me for the next episode. Thanks for listening.